From the News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. Nick Barris here on a Monday, and I invite you to join in the conversation. We had, as I said last week, another show scheduled for today. Allison Fields was going to come on to take your calls about animals and such. She's a veterinarian. We decided to put that on hold, and Allison's terrific. She'll be coming back and joining us again in a few days, but we wanted to shift things around when we received news yesterday that former Tennessee U.S. Senator, presidential candidate at one time, actor, someone very well known in the state, Fred Thompson, passed away at the age of 73. And we thought, you know, this is a big story. This is a very important individual with what he meant to the state and the country. I know many of you have thoughts on it. It's really blown up on Facebook, on my Facebook page, the station Facebook page. So we thought we'd shift things around, and we're going to talk about Fred Thompson, his life, the man. Take your phone call, 737-7587. If you want to share any thoughts on him as well this morning, we'd love to hear from you. But we're going to talk about it with someone who interviewed him several times, someone who I think knows Fred Thompson from over the years, and that would be our political analyst here at News Channel 5, Pat Nolan. It's good to have you on. And here we're showing some video right there of Fred Thompson during his brief presidential run. Yes. They were just showing some clips. Good to have you on this morning.
Good to be here.
You interviewed him several times, did you not?
I did. In fact, I had, until I got in here this morning, they went back through the archives and found an interview I did with the last interview I guess I did with him when he was a lobbyist for the trial lawyers involved with the tort reform bills that were going up for the legislature. Now, those bills passed despite him being against it. But having been involved in some of that, I did see a situation where we'd go into the committee room and he was like a rock star. All the lawmakers wanted his autograph. They wanted their pictures taken. And of course, they all wanted them for their children, of course. And then they'd go in committee and ultimately they voted against him. But it was like being up against a rock star. Or a real phenomenon, and that's kind of how his presidential campaign was. The only thing I can compare it to is how people were with Donald Trump this year, although Trump's managed to find a way to sustain it. Unfortunately for Fred Thompson, when he got into the presidential race, it just didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, I got the sense from him at that point that I think he believed he'd be a good president, and a lot of people supported him. But I also got the sense that, yeah, he was going to go for it, but I don't want to say that his heart wasn't in it. But at the same time, I just got the sense that, look, I'm going to do it my way, and if that's not what's going to work, I'll walk away, and it's not going to bother me one iota.
I think that's right. I think I don't want to question his motives or his determination, but I don't think. I think he decided, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do to this point. If that's good enough, then great. I really want to be president in that regard, but I'm not going to do everything within powers or even beyond powers. I think I had to do that.
Yeah. Again, 73 years old. I was telling Pat when I sat down this morning that I had last seen, and I had gotten a chance to meet him on a few. He wouldn't know me, but I met him, and we were at a banquet last year, maybe around this time, maybe a little bit before this, and he looked well. He looked well, and he certainly didn't give any indication that he was ill that night, and he was on form, gave the keynote address. But we were just talking about how he had been first diagnosed with cancer back in 2004, and I guess this was a recurrence of lymphoma, and none of us really knew about this. It surprised a lot of people yesterday.
He was pretty quiet about those things. It did remind me as well that when he decided not to seek another term in the Senate, he didn't say this directly, but there was some illness in his family, I believe, with one of his children, and he decided that he wanted to spend more time with his family to do that and not run for re-election. And of course, that opened the door for Lamar Alexander to become the U.S. Senator in that seat. And it's interesting to see how much time has actually passed by. Lamar Alexander is now into his third term in the U.S. Senate, and those are 6-year terms, so that means you've had quite a few years pass before Senator Thompson went off the main stage. But you know, he was
only a senator one term, right? Was it 8 years?
8 years, but remember, he served the last 2 years of Al Gore's term.
That's right. Okay.
And then he spent his entire he had full term himself, got reelected, and I think when he got reelected, it was close to margins that nobody had ever seen before at that time in terms of that. But his popularity in politics stayed pretty high, particularly in Tennessee. You might recall even last year when Lamar Alexander was running for re-election, at least one of his TV spots was voiced by Fred Thompson, and that voice was unmistakable. When you heard Fred Thompson speak, you knew it was Fred.
Sure. He was, you know, before I really knew who Fred Thompson was, I remember when I first got hired here, working with Larry Britton, and of course I had to go see the movie Marie.
Oh, absolutely.
Which Larry was in, along with Fred Thompson, both of them key players in the big Blanton story that some of you will remember, and many of you that are just here won't know exactly. But it was a corruption scandal involving the governor. But it was interesting that both these, Britton is the reporter, Fred Thompson is, an attorney, were very, very involved in that case, and they played themselves in the movie. And Fred, that's where he got his start as an actor.
Fred parlayed that into his movie career.
But he just wasn't a big name and politician. How neat to have him play himself. He's a good actor. He was a good actor.
Well, and if you think about it, of all the times you saw Fred Thompson, whether it was on Law and Order on television or whether it was in the movies, Fred Thompson played himself. He really never played anybody else that was any different.
I think you're right. I mean, he played himself. I mean, I still remember him. I thought he was great as just a smaller role in Hunt for Red October, the Tom Clancy movie. That was just a terrific movie, and he played the submarine captain. And then of course, he was in, I guess, one of the recent Die Hard or more recent Die Hard movies. And the big thing, a lot of people remember him from, and you're right, he played himself as an attorney in a lot of ways, Law and Order. But he was good.
He was good. He was good.
I mean, and that got him even more fame. A lot of people know him more as the actor than the politician over the last few years.
He had that word that was used a few years ago when they were talking about Dick Cheney as vice president. I don't want to compare these two politically, but he had gravitas. But he had a lot of good old boy into him too. He was very much down home and pretty much straightforward. And the interesting thing about Fred is, whether he was acting or whether he was a politician, everybody saw that he was straightforward and he was himself. People, whether you're acting or in your politics, people spot a phony pretty quickly, and they could tell Fred Thompson was who he was.
One of the things I posted on my Facebook page when this happened that it got a little bit of reaction was just in my dealing with him. I want to know if you agree with this or not. It seems to me Fred Thompson, obviously a Republican here, elected, very popular, but he seemed like the type of politician we need more today, in that while he had some very strongly held conservative beliefs, it just seemed back at that time, you can say this in general about a lot of politicians from back then now compared to today, that the partisanship only went so far with him, and he would draw the line whether or not he would upset some of his Republican colleagues or go after some of the Democrats, trying to do what he felt was best for the country and compromise, whatever you want to call it. But I appreciated him for that he wasn't just so. Think about this, and we need to go back. He was right there with Howard Baker going after President Nixon during Watergate, all right? You see that happening today? If there was a Republican president in trouble, do you think a bunch of Republicans or vice versa Democrat would go after him? Wouldn't happen today, Pat. They'd look the other way on either side. Back then, Fred Thompson and Howard Baker went after Nixon for Watergate.
Well, it's very interesting. Fred Thompson's claim to fame within the Watergate scandal was that he was the minority counsel on the Watergate committee, and he got that job because Howard Baker was the lead Republican on the committee. But Fred Thompson was the person who, on a Friday afternoon late, because I was working at WPLN Radio back in those days, we were carrying those hearings live. They brought on a guy named Alexander Butterfield, and he was an aide in the White House who was in charge of the recording system, although most people didn't know there was a recording system in the White House. Well, any good lawyer, I'm sure, had deposed Mr. Butterfield before he went up there. He knew what he was going to tell him. And so did Howard Baker. And with what you're talking about, you have to ask yourself today, the question was, would a senator, would a lead staff attorney for one of the parties decide they're going to bring that kind of information? Because once Butterfield admitted that there was a taping system, and when it's a very famous piece of tape, if you not, and I'm sure you may see it again on this. Of course. When Fred Thompson asked him about it, there was this long pause, and suddenly I think Butterfield said, "Well, I was afraid you were going to ask me that question," and he went ahead and told what was there.
And that blew it open.
Watergate changed completely. Yes. It was no longer I said, he said. Nobody knew what the truth was. People knew there could be the truth here, and I do suspect that both Fred Thompson and Howard Baker thought that taping system might wind up being the salvation for Richard Nixon. It turned out to be the noose around his neck.
That's right. Okay. But exactly. And so what I've thought about Fred, and that you don't see as much today to some degree in my opinion, is that he tried to do what was right. Whether it was partisan politics or not, he tried to do what was best for the country. And you may be right. They thought the tapes would exonerate the president. Who knows? Wasn't he all...
One thing that brought that said the same thing today, yesterday, was Senator Bill Frist, who was the majority leader at one point during his time in the Senate. They served in the Senate together for all 8 years. They went to the Senate together in 1994. And one of the things he talked about, Fred Thompson, was his ability to work across the aisle when on issues that he thought was the right thing to do. So yes, that kind of bipartisanship is, I wouldn't say it's impossible to find in Washington, but it's been pretty close to an extinct species for the last couple of years.
Yeah, and here's a guy, too, that because of that, it doesn't surprise you that he served the final 2 years of Gore's term, and then 8 of his own, and he, you know as well as I do, could have easily been reelected, but it wasn't all about, but you know, there are some lawmakers today that, you know, they'll do whatever they can to maintain their seat. I'm sorry. To heck with whether or not it's for the best of the country or whatever. They're just going to say and do whatever. He just did what he thought was best, and he didn't want to run again. So that kind of gave him a certain sense of freedom, I think. I really valued him as a politician, the way he did things across the aisle, like you said. Listen, we'll take a break on that. We've got some calls coming in, Paul, Candy, and others. The number 737-7587. We have some clips of your interview with him that we're going to play. And we may be able to pull a story that Ben Hall put together last night, kind of looking back at Fred Thompson's life as well. But we want you to join in the conversation. Agree, disagree with us, or any thoughts or memories. Would he have made a good president? We'd like to hear from you. We'll be back with more right after this.